Hi, I'm Michael Smart, Rock Creek Global Advisors. Libby and Warren, you both mentioned the importance of binding arbitration. I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit more in terms of mitigating the risk of double taxation and avoiding that incentive for offshoring, Warren, that you talked about. And also where this administration is on that, because in other contexts, obviously, they're quite hostile to putting third-party arbitration in international agreements. And is this just a different case, or are they taking a new look at this?
I'll just start, since I have the microphone, by saying that the reason we are interested in having arbitration as, or you might call it robust dispute resolution measures, is the latest term for anyone who is offended by the arbitration word, is not so that we end up arbitrating. It's that the possibility of having that mechanism at the end of the process encourages countries to resolve the disputes with us over what we owe and where way sooner than getting to that point.
I'll answer the second part of the question first, which is yes, the Treasury is very strongly in favor of binding arbitration in this context. And it's not unusual in this context. There's arbitration kind of has been an issue around tax treaties for a long time, and over time as the tax treaty rules have developed, there's been more emphasis on binding arbitration. The extent to which binding arbitration can be, I don't think it can be a silver bullet. I think it can be a substantially important way of improving the circumstances. First, I think to the point that Kathy made and Jen made, the binding arbitration would only apply to what the OECD agreement is. And so if countries don't repeal these other measures, having binding arbitration as part of the OECD doesn't address that. Two, even within the context of the OECD negotiations, they've kind of created three buckets of tax. And the binding arbitration only clearly is indicated to apply to one of those three. And more importantly, it doesn't apply to the bucket where everybody gets to jump in and reallocate, and grab new tax revenue. In concept, we're maybe not supposed to need it for that bucket because it's supposed to be very formulaic, and it's just a simple math equation and nobody fights over it. But I think the point Libby made, the landscape is changing so rapidly, it's hard to have a lot of confidence in how anything is going to resolve itself. So yes, the administration is for it. Yes, it would be helpful. Not sure it's a silver bullet.
And I'd like to just add one more thing to that. As Warren said, part of our treaty system, the U.S. has for a long time been pushing for mandatory binding arbitration, and the Treasury Department's been very strong on this. And it basically is to bring other negotiators to the table. If you don't have a negotiation that requires some sort of a binding agreement, people can have some of these disputes languish for a very long time. And so by having a binding arbitration, what it basically means is two countries can get together and resolve the dispute because they have a set time limit to resolve those disputes. And one of the reasons Treasury and the IRS have always pushed for this is so that some of these disputes don't linger for years because the other side has the money and they don't really care to resolve the dispute and have to have some way of basically coming to a middle ground on that. But as part of this, one of the things that we've had in the past is we have had bilateral negotiations on resolving disputes. Because of the way the OECD project is moving and because of a number of countries potentially claiming the same money, we may be moving into something on a more multilateral basis for dispute resolution, which we have never dealt with before. We usually deal with our disputes through our tax treaty process. But dealing with this through a multilateral is a new move for just this whole discussion, and how the U.S. will respond to that is unclear at this point.
Thanks very much. Sherry Stevenson, formerly with the ICTSD in Geneva. Could you please, anyone in the panel or all, elaborate a little bit further? You just mentioned it on the motivations of developing countries and their desire to remove or to do away with the moratorium on e-commerce in the WTO, and how that relates or not to what is going on in the OECD with regards to digital taxation.
Thank you. I don't know that I have a lot more to say beyond what was covered, but just to reiterate the point that I made is that as Kathy highlighted in her introduction, there's a lot going on in the same general space, right? We have this conversation going on around tax. There's an ongoing conversation at the WTO about how to handle tariffs on digital goods. And the comment that I made is that there's some similarities in terms of what is being elevated in the OECD context and what is being elevated in the WTO context about how certain jurisdictions feel about trying to retain some of this economic value with, with their taxing rights. So I don't think that they're directly comparable situations, but I just think that there are some general similarities that I've detected in both of those fora because I do work in both. So.
The other thing is, as both Warren and Libby have mentioned, this goes beyond the OECD countries. The inclusive framework includes 135 countries. And those 135 countries are all part of these negotiations at the OECD, and they are part of the consensus building around an agreement. A lot of those countries are countries who are looking to increase revenues. So some of the countries that are being more aggressive under the WTO Moratorium are also ones that are sitting at the table at the OECD trying to negotiate these additional taxing rights.
Jacob Nelson from Steptoe and Johnson. I have a question for Jennifer and Warren. You both seem to mention this idea of whether or not, Jennifer, you said that U.S. companies would not be able to credit these DST payments to, for example, France against their U.S. corporate income tax liabilities. And so I wanted to ask about it again to get sort of an explicit answer from you and also from Warren. My understanding was that there was some whether or not these taxes were considered revenue or income taxes had some bearing on whether or not these companies would be able to credit those payments against their U.S. liabilities. And I was kind of under the impression that the answer to this was not clear, but I'd love to hear if you think that this is sort of a decided upon question or whether or not there's some uncertainty.
I'm going to let Warren take that one. Kathy, I think, also probably did a lot of research on this. I could see her issue for it.
She's ready to go. You want to go first, Kathy?
Yeah. The way the French DST is set up, they took it outside of the income tax system. So we have three levels of tax. We have the income tax, we have the DST, which is a gross receipts tax, and then we have their VAT. So there's three separate levels of tax. They put it specifically out of the income tax system because it violates the U.S. treaty with France, which now has a physical presence PE. They couldn't do that because there is no physical presence standard as part of this DST. According to Treasury, and we've had a lot of conversations with them about it, because this is a gross receipts tax and it is not an income tax and basically it's not creditable against the U.S., one of the things that the French have said is that they would allow companies who are paying the DST to credit some of those taxes against the income taxes that they owe in France. So if you have some credit from your DST, from the gross receipts tax, to France, if they credit that as an income tax, that piece of the income tax could be creditable to the U.S. But how much they do that is unclear right now because they're doing their implementing language. Companies have already had to pay the DST, but there's an awful lot of ambiguity as to exactly how that cross-crediting is going to work between what the companies are paying and what happens on their French income tax. But that is the piece that could potentially be creditable against the U.S. But that's, again, we don't have enough detail on that just yet because they're still trying to work that out.
So generally, I completely agree with Kathy's description of how this is supposed to work. I would offer three other observations. The first is that, yes, the French have clearly tried to put their DST outside the scope of kind of the income tax norms. I also think Treasury has accepted that. I think there is a strategic question that stakeholders can think about is whether you challenge that concept and say, notwithstanding what the French are saying about it, this really should be within the scope of the income tax treaties, and there are all kinds of reasons for that. The issue about kind of it's being creditable, even outside the scope of it being income tax. I can think of at least one example where Treasury has permitted companies to take U.S. credits against something that's not clearly an income tax, right? So even if Treasury were to accept the French arguments, they could say, well, from a U.S. perspective, we're still going to allow it to be creditable. There's a big impact there. There's a big fiscal impact there, right, for the U.S. Treasury. That means it's tax revenue we're not collecting. And in fact, we're essentially allowing France to collect that tax revenue and keep it. And the third is this issue of credibility is one of the key areas of friction between tax and trade rules, and whether or not what the French are doing in this particular context is discriminatory. Again, go back to the normal rules and the way the normal trading system has worked. If all I'm doing is exporting a product to France, whether it's a good or a service or something digital, I'm not in the French income tax net. Now, these new rules are saying, even if all I'm doing is, all I am is an exporter, I'm being captured. But if I'm purely just an exporter, I probably don't have any French income tax liability. So the fact that the French are providing this deduction or credit against French income tax liability actually does me no benefit. Whereas if there is kind of one random French company that gets captured by the DST and has to pay the DST, well, they will get the benefit of that deduction, and therefore that provides them a competitive advantage. Are we competing in the same like product? Is that difference in deductibility now discriminatory? So that's kind of just another example of where these tax and trade concepts start to rub up against each other and create friction.
Hello, Rachel Pfeffer from Congressional Research Service. You had said that the United States supports broadening the OECD conversations away from just digital products and services to broader intangibles overall. So I wanted to see if you could provide some specific examples of something like movies or intellectual property and such. And secondly, it sounds like the companies support the broader scope because it would provide more certainty if you can agree to rules. But are there any parties in the OECD conversations that are really trying to narrow the scope and keep it really just to digital products and services?
On the first part of your question, there's no good way to define kind of what is an intangible-based traded product, or what share of the revenue comes from the intangible part of the product versus the tangible part of the product. And so the discussions right now are, we're just going to use your level of profitability as a proxy. And so if it's a consumer-facing transaction, and as Libby noted, that's not a fully well-defined term yet, but if it is a consumer-facing transaction, and you are engaging in that transaction in that market, and that transaction, to be determined exactly how you measure profitability, but whether that transaction or that part of your business or your company is clear some profit threshold, then some of that profit would get to be reallocated. So we're about 3 proxies into the calculation at that point. And then I'll let Libby answer the couple specific questions.
I would just note there is a lot of diversity of opinion among companies in the business community, as you would normally see. But the general consensus seems to be that we should basically lock arms and try to support a multilateral process at the OECD that can draw some conclusions. We are not in a rush for this process, as the process seems to be being rushed. So one of the things we're doing is encouraging them to take the time to be principled and thoughtful. I think probably some would like to, imagine their best outcome as DSTs that they're not scoped into, and that be the end of it. But I think the reason that there is a lot of consensus to stay at the table and to support a broader solution is that there is no guarantee that it would stop at that point. And there is no guarantee that the OECD process, should it, come to some broad consensus, would end there. But we have to try. That's really why we are at the table.
And the question about whether there are some OECD countries who would like to limit the scope, there actually are some countries at the table who want to limit the scope as much as possible because they do see this as, if you're looking at consumer-facing companies and user-friendly companies, they see that as being more, again, focused on American companies, and if they can limit the scope, they can keep more of their companies out of it. So there are some OECD countries who are pushing very hard within the negotiations at the OECD to limit the scope as much as possible to try to protect their own domestic businesses.
Hi, Doug Palmer with Politico. I have a question for Jen, and I have to apologize because I've sort of lost track of this 301 investigation that USTR is doing into digital service tax. There's so many other things going on that I haven't been able to pay close attention to it. But you said...
I envy you.
But you said that it would be important to see how the U.S. responds at the end of this month. So is there a deadline in the 301 investigation at the end of the month, or were you referring to the digital service tax in France will go into effect at the end of the month? Why is the end of this month why do we need to know how the U.S. responds at the end of this month?
That's a great question, and I will say that I don't know that there's a firm deadline in terms of the period that was agreed to by the U.S. and France when they met at the G20 and had a conversation about putting a hold on any kind of retaliation in response to the 301 investigation. But that was about 3 months from, 3 months ago at the end of this month, and so we anticipate that the U.S. will probably make a decision about how to move forward within that time frame. And so that's our best kind of estimate of what we can expect to come next. And so the message I was trying to convey to this room is that we think that the end of this month will likely, bring some kind of indication from the U.S. about how they intend to proceed with the trade aspect of the DSTs. And I think that if there isn't any kind of decision, that's likely a reflection of the OECD process moving ahead productively, because these two things are fairly tied together at this point. And so that said, I think that they take their response to the French measure very seriously, because France is considered to be the first kind of adopter of this policy. And so whatever they do in this sense will set a tone for what, we can expect the reaction to be to other measures. And one thing that we haven't discussed in this, we've been very focused on France, and I'm sure people in this room know, they're not alone in pursuing this policy. We've seen a number of countries since the détente was reached between the US and France actually move forward with DST proposals. Most recently, we saw Turkey move ahead with a policy that has some certain features, like the ability for the president to unilaterally change the rate or the scope of it whenever he would like. Obviously, that's a step, or probably several steps in the wrong direction from what we would consider to be acceptable, but this is accelerating. And Canada has also mentioned the DST in their political process that led up to the recent election, and so we're following those developments very closely. But this end of the month, the French timeline, I think, will be, they will have in mind all of the things going on in this space, and so we're tracking that very closely.
Is there any estimate of how much the value of U.S. retaliation would be if they were to decide to impose 301 tariffs?
I look forward to reading the report. Yeah. I don't have that information, and I think that that's one of the things that we would see out of the report. And just issuing the report from our perspective is a productive step, so we can start to see how the U.S. government views the impact in terms of our trading relationships. Thank you.
Good morning. Dan Peterson with Americans for Prosperity. I'd like to compliment the panel for doing a really good job of persuading me that the situation regarding taxation of digital services is really, really uncertain and that things are kind of a mess. My words, okay. If we were to flip the calendar pages forward, what are your thoughts on how long it will take before there is greater certainty and that the business community has become comfortable with some new tax approach that serves the global economy and allows it to grow? I mean, if we came and met a year from now, how different would your comments be? 2 years, 5 years? Speculate, please.
I'll start since I have the microphone. The OECD project is supposed to be completed by the end of 2020. That's not the implementation, that's just if they, their time frame for reaching agreement within the OECD and the inclusive framework is by the end of 2020. As far as certainty, I mean, the business community just went through the BEPS project. They went through US tax reform. Now we're working through this OECD project. Once they reach agreement, there's going to have to be implementing legislation. And if all of these particular pieces of this puzzle are not necessarily agreed to, when they finally do reach some sort of an agreement, those other pieces will continue. For the business community, we've been in a level of uncertainty for quite a number of years, and the idea that we're constantly adding new things to it is a problem. We've been talking about mainly the sort of the nexus profit allocation big changes. The second part of that is Pillar 2, which is minimum tax type of things, which are not subject to a consensus agreement. This is stuff that governments will have the opportunity to determine whether or not they want to impose those or not. So even though they could reach a consensus here, we are still in the process of making sure that other governments aren't going to continue to do additional minimum taxes on top of our GILTI taxes that the U.S. is paying. So if you start to look 2 years ahead, 3 years ahead, 5 years ahead, if you looked 5 years from now, could you say that this is where we were going to be? I would say no. Nobody would have thought that we would have had tax reform and then be in this new OECD project. So I would not want to speculate, but I would say that we have been living in a time of uncertainty, and it has been very difficult for companies to get any kind of certainty, and I don't see that changing anytime in the near future.
I would just add one point to what Kathy just said, and that's that this uncertainty, this kind of messy dynamic is something that I think that the countries participating in the OECD process, particularly those leading on, they have a steering committee of countries, are very aware of. And so, a counterbalance to kind of the disorganized and kind of unclear pathway forward is a pretty clear understanding that we need to do something collectively about these problems. And so that's where I find a lot of hope in this process, is that there is a certain understanding of the downside risks and a focus that meets that moment. I mean, we are not in a big era of multilateralism right now, yet we have this thriving negotiation going on. And that's where I find promise in this process.
You guys have any comments on that?
Hi, Jen Riccardi from the EU. I guess I'm Kathy's, Halloween surprise. I'm going to try really hard to respect Ken's rule and not make comments. I do want to say that business doesn't have a problem with European governments or other foreign country governments. You have a problem with the government. There's a political impetus behind these proposals, and I think that's what you're seeing in many countries around the world. We'll get off my soapbox and ask my question. EU fully for the OECD multilateral process. That was the reason why the DST proposal was brought forward by the Commission in the first place, was to get people to the table of the multilateral process. It should move forward. But at the end of the day, if there is agreement at the OECD, what are the prospects in the U.S.? Last time I checked, Congress didn't like passing treaties of any sort. Congress seems to like to do tax legislation every 25 years, and I've been told from some hill, well, we've done it, we're not going back. Thank you.
I'll just point out we did do 4 bilateral treaties this year, so we are moving forward with treaties. So it's not that we're no longer doing them. We actually got 4 of them done. So
It took 12 years though.
I'm just adding that we actually did get some of the treaties done.
You guys want to speculate on comments? As a former Ways and Means
As a former Ways think the outlook for how the United States implements any agreement depends a lot on what's the agreement. First of all, how much of it can be done via the regulatory process versus the legislative process. I think that's very much TBD. The more expansive in scope and change, obviously the more statutory change and legislative change would be required. I think the willingness or the appetite of Congress to act on that will depend extensively on what the substance of the outcome is. The substance of the outcome is something that provides certainty that everyone on the panel has talked about, that is viewed as being fair, as in it's not like the DSTs kind of explicitly targeting U.S. companies. That's a big question. I mean, there would be huge factors. What the revenue impact will be is going to be a factor. There's no doubt about it. I mean, I think there is a debate about whether or not the U.S. could actually come out with net revenue out of it. I'm skeptical of that myself for a variety of reasons, but there are folks who think this could possibly be, net revenue positive for the U.S. That obviously would be a huge factor. And so those, until we have a lot more certainty on what the outcome is, it's hard to understand how the implementation process in the U.S. is going to go. And I will refrain from commenting on the soapbox comment because I got a really good one, but I'm going to let it go.
Yeah, just to add very quickly to those excellent points, we have seen an uncommon amount of bipartisanship on these issues to date. I've been in a lot of the meetings. A lot of people on the Hill are really concerned about the indicators of this problem, and that concern is on both sides of the Hill, both parties. And so I think adding on to Warren's point, all of those factors will come into play, but the level of understanding and concern is there, I think, for a compelling set of arguments to be made for some kind of congressional action. So, for what it's worth. Also, I'm from the Hill. If you start thinking about how to get something done at the outset, you probably will have a hard time taking step one. So, I think that there's some element that we just have to keep doing the work and see where this goes.